think if I'm missing anything. Again, we're looking at a lot of other things to understand these behaviors too, like yield components. Are we putting more tillers? Are we putting larger heads, heavier grains? So we're doing all that yield component analysis as well. That's more for us to understand what's driving yields, right? Yes?
What was the timing on the nitrogen application?
That's a great question. What was the timing on the nitrogen application? So the timing of the nitrogen application here was spring green up. We didn't have anything going into, well, whatever was left in the soil in the fall was what we had through the winter. And then we came here at spring green up. Now, right there on the back, we have a neighboring trial that goes with all of these trials that we're looking at timing by source interaction. So we're going over there with a rate of 60. So we want to be a little bit on the short end, right? We're going with a rate of 60. And over there we have 4 different rates. So it's a UAN, then UAN plus a stabilizer, urea, and urea plus a stabilizer. And we have that combined across everything at green up. 30% in the fall, the rest in the spring, right? So we want to do that trial at not. So if we look at here, right, probably visually, probably levels out at 90 or 120 in terms of visually what we think on yield potential here. If you walk down here, I mean, you can even. I don't know, but it seems to me like it does get better from there. Whether it's going to result in grain yield or not, we need to analyze the data to see, right? But so we wanted in that nitrogen, that couple trial there with nitrogen timing by source, we wanted to be a little bit on the deficient end, right? So then when we put this curve, we can compare the 60 that we have here, which is all UAN in the spring, with those other sources, right? What if we compare that 60 with if it was UAN? What is it going to do? If it was urea, if you had a stabilizer, right? So we have that neighboring trial in all of the locations where we have this trial here around the state as well. Again, trying to update our nitrogen recommendations via variety and also source and timing of the fertilizer here. Yes?
So we know that the yield is affected by the protein or vice versa. So in terms of management, do you recommend high fertilizer rate for low protein variety or high nitrogen for high protein variety?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a little bit there on the question was on the yield protein relationship and then nitrogen recommendation per variety, right? So the yield protein relationship is something that I really enjoy talking about. So let's think how the plant is working. Right? How is it working through the season there? Think a few weeks back when it was flowering, right? You could see those anthers coming out. At that point in time, usually the plant has taken up about 80% of what it needs, nitrogen total in the season, right? So about 80% is already there. Now, what is protein made of? Amino acids, primarily nitrogen, right? So that nitrogen is at the plant already by antithesis, most of it, about 80% plus, and is going to be remobilized, right, from leaves and from stem all the way to the grain fairly early. As soon as flowering is done, 15 to 20 days later, a lot of that protein is already packed in the grain. Because again, it's already there, it just needs to remobilize, right? So fairly early in the grain filling period, we determine protein. Now, what happens with yield is what drives yield? What's the other big component in the grain? Right on, starch. And starch is a different process. So, in terms of protein, again, early on, it's taken up at the plant and it's just remobilizing. Starch, on the other hand, we need sunlight and we need CO2, right? Carbon dioxide. And the plant's going to take up that CO2, is going to use the energy from the sun to break it down and to make sugars, and those sugars go and they are stored as starch in the grain, right? So it's made on the go, whereas protein, a lot of it is by the time it flowers out, it's kind of packed there already, right? So because starch is a slower and longer process, if we have cool grain field weather, we have more days for the plant to put starch in the grain. And so we have that negative relationship that you mentioned, right? High yield, lower protein. Now, what happens most years in Kansas? What happens there in the late part of May? It gets really hot. And so that heat stress, then it shuts down kind of the starch accumulation in the plant, or it really reduces the rate that is making that photosynthesis and putting sugars in the grain. And with that, our protein is already packed there. We cut down starch accumulation, and then our protein goes through the roof and our yield goes down, right? So that's simply because we have less starch accumulating in the grain, and so the protein is already there because it's an early process, right? So that's kind of like the way the plant works. Now we're taking those measurements at antithesis to see, again, that 80% that it takes up of nitrogen by that time. Is it true for all varieties, or are maybe some of these varieties that are relying more on that early nitrogen take up, and maybe it's 100%, or some varieties that are relying more on grain fuel nitrogen take up, right? So we're trying to understand that dynamics here as well. And whether we are doing different fertility recommendations based on the protein content of the variety, that's kind of what we're trying to answer here, right? I know that in regions where they grow both soft wheat and hard wheat, they do that. Many times they are applying, sometimes, I was actually just reading an article from France, and over there, they're putting about 70% of the nitrogen, well, let's say they put 100% on the hard nitrogen, right, on the hard wheat. They're putting about 70% on the soft wheat. And there's a yield drag, about a 10% less yield because you're deficient on nitrogen, right? But they don't need that much protein for the end products, right? So they can get by with way less protein. So on balance, 10% yield drag versus 30% less nitrogen, that sometimes it still pays off to go that direction. Now that's a big difference between soft wheat that you need 9-10% protein and a hard where you need 12 or 13, right? And here we're just comparing hard wheat. So I don't expect that large of a difference as they were reporting in that one report. But that's what we're trying to see. A variety like 4699, it's very low on the protein end, on the spectrum of protein, right? It's really low. So is that an opportunity to maybe pull nitrogen back down a little bit and still maintain yields, right? That's the type of thing we're trying to look at here. So we don't have the answer to the second part of your question yet. Hopefully by the end of this year. Yes.
All the plots here are individual varieties. A good share of the wheat that is planted in Kansas is blends. I don't know how high it is, but it's pretty high. Should we be using this nitrogen uptake information to choose the blends that we plant?
Oh, that's a good question, huh? Yeah, I think that the most widely variety planted in the state is blend, right? If I'm not mistaken there. But so blends, they have their own advantages, disadvantages as well, right? I think at this moment, well, that could be if it turns out so let me backtrack a little bit here. So blends, in terms of how we use them, in terms of advantages and so on, right? If we look at a lot of research that has been published comparing blends versus the standalone of those varieties, across a lot of data there, blends seem to have a 1.5, 2% advantage in yield. Now, that happens mostly not because it has a higher yield potential, but because maybe it holds a little bit better under some type of stress. For example, there's a freeze damage. Well, the blends, just escaping on maturity, you might do better in that situation. So that's kind of how we typically see blends. Is like, okay, let's try to hedge for some risks that we have, whether it is slightly different maturities, not the spectrum, right? But it's slightly different, so we're escaping the freeze or increasing your chance to escape the freeze. Or if you really like some variety but it doesn't have the standability, you can kind of put up with a couple of varieties that have better standability, right? So you're trying to hedge your risks there. If we would come up with the results from this research suggesting, yes, we need different management for nitrogen for each one of these varieties or variety types, that could be something to look at, right? So say, okay, well, I want the varieties that are going to be more bang for my buck, so less nitrogen for the same bushel. So I'm going to select 3 blends that are in that group, 3 varieties to put that blend, the varieties that are in that category, right? and then you can even look at their other agronomics and go based on, okay, well now if I have this group here of the race horses, right, am I planning to put a fungicide? If so, then you don't even need to look at their stripe rust resistance or something, right? You should look at scab, but not the stripe rust, right? Or at least, so then you can make your decisions based on that.
We
But
should look at it, but yeah.
so I'm not confident yet to say yes to that question. Again, because it's very preliminary data, right? But after this next year, we're going to have 15 sites where we look at these, and yield is going to range from 8 bushels to 60 last year. This year we're looking probably at 15, 20, all the way to probably 70 or 80. So it's going to be a pretty wide range of yielding conditions that we can answer that question. So it might be something that in the future, if you're looking for a blend, there could be a nitrogen use efficient blend or something. That'll market well, I think.
How to say, I see the responses in different environments is significant. So in terms of packaging the recommendation, do you package along the environment? I just want to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, great question there. So the environments differed a lot in their responses, right? And
Repeat the question, we couldn't hear.
absolutely. So the question was that environment played a significant role in our responses. It definitely did. If you look at those figures, right? Each environment was different there. And how do we package these into our extension recommendations, right? Right now, that's based on your expected yield goal, right? So if your expected yield goal was 15 or 20, right, you might not need any nitrogen there. If your expected yield goal was 60, then so that right now that's kind of based on the expected yield goal. A few things that are going on in that for us to improve that recommendation is we're working a lot on environment characterization in Kansas. So getting long-term weather data and trying to come up with subregions on the state where, based on weather, we know that the wheat environment tends to be more uniform. We did that, and it turns out, I think, when we break down by soils as well, because you get there to south central Kansas, there's quite a bit of difference in the soils, right, that they're playing with across the road sometimes, even the same field. So when you break that by soil, I think that we're needing 90 plus regions to cover the entire state. So we don't need to cover the entire state. If we're going to cover the bulk of it, 70 or 80% of the state, we still need a pretty much, we were talking about this, Josh, last year. I think we needed 8 or 9 environments to cover like 60 or 70% of the wheat area in Kansas, right? So if we can break our recommendations that way, that could be another way to look at it as well. Again, this is some of the research work that we are doing in the program. Nothing that it's in my extension program yet, because we wanted ground truth in research first. If we say, yes, this should work, then we move that direction. Another thing that we're doing, we have a PhD student now. He's working on trying to estimate the yield potential a little bit better, right? So what we're doing is we collected a lot of historical nitrogen trials that we've done over the years and that some colleagues have done over the years as well. And we have the nitrogen application date. So we have exactly the point when the nitrogen was applied. So what we're doing is we're going back. I think we're close to 100 trials already where we have nitrogen response. And we're getting weather data in each one of those 100 trials, right, daily. And now we're simulating the yield potential of the crop in the start of the season if the weather was anything like the last 30 years and so, right? Now we simulate it until nitrogen application date. And from that point in time, we have scenarios based on the previous weather for that location, right? So, okay, well, at that point in time, if the weather is like our best years, our yield potential is 80 bushels or 90, right? If the weather from here forward is going to be like our worst years, maybe it's 25, right? So we're trying to do that estimate of the yield potential in season to then inform that nitrogen decision as well, right? Now there's a big range of your yield at that point in time, right? And we're trying to see, okay, how can we have a bit more confidence there? Can we incorporate weather forecasts, like longer term weather forecasts? Oh, this year's supposed to be a La Nina, right? So how do we treat those simulations? So essentially for each location we're doing we're looking at 30 years of weather data, and we're doing those simulations of yield potential until application date using that year's weather, and then from application date to harvest using the last 30 years to try and see what's the range of yield potential, and based on what the weathermen are telling us that the season will look like, where does our yield potential fall. Again, it's all research, right? We still don't have anything that is translated into our recommendations yet, but I guess that's part of the reason we wanted to do this field day, is kind of to show up some of those things that we are doing. Another thing that we're doing as well, more preliminary a little bit, but also has a nitrogen component and also has a fungicide component, Kelsey is part of it, is we're working with computer scientists on the artificial intelligence side of things, right? Like think of a ChatGPT. You go there, you ask a question, and it comes up with an answer. You have no idea what that answer, how much you can trust that. We're exploring how can we do that based on K-State recommendations, so that let's say that you would have on the future, right, a K-State ChatGPT that you can go there and ask, my field is in this location, and I want to put nitrogen. What do you recommend? And then, based on all the K-State knowledge, right, you would come up with an answer. So it will be an answer that you could trust, because it would be coming from years and years of research and gazillions of data out there, right? As compared to right now, we have no idea where the answer is coming from. So we're working on that. We're still a few years down the road until we get to anything like that, but it's quite promising. Kelsey did an awesome job on that, and she has a little fungicide chat there that, I mean, again, it's just in the background yet, right? But you can ask a few questions and it's already providing some answers. So. Now, one thing that I can say is that working with computer scientists, they speak a different language, right? So it took us, yeah, we took them to the field so they could see a wheat plant, right, for the first time. And at the same time, it took us 2 years to understand what they were talking. So it goes both ways. But it's been fun and a lot of learning there. And I think there's a huge potential for us to put a lot of our data that right now, you need to search for a PDF into just a quick, you ask a question and it spills out what information is here already, right? So we're working towards that. Still probably a few years down the road, but a lot of exciting things coming up.